you are going to have a certain portion of your team, just because it's natural human behavior, that are highly resistant to change. Hi, I'm Russ.
And I'm Danny.
And this is the Memory Makers Podcast.
The show focused on helping you create amazing customer experiences and make more memories.
Memory Makers Podcast. A little Backstreet Boys for you there. Backstreet's back all right. You know why?
I like it. And it was nice and succinct, and it was just like punchy.
Yeah, I had to do it because you are back from Kilimanjaro, friend. Hiking that mountain. Climbing that mountain.
Climbing that mountain. Summiting that mountain. Spoiler alert, we summited. We made it to the top. And we made it back, and we're all in one piece.
Yes. Oh, how was it, man? I mean, just absolutely incredible, some of the photos and stories that you've shared, but just sounds super transformative and amazing.
I will say this. It was an incredible trip. It was, think of a descriptor, and it was that. It was fun. It was exciting. It was challenging. It was hard. It was all the stuff, right?
Yes.
And a question I've already gotten a lot from people is, well, was it a life-changing trip? And in processing it with my wife and some of the people who were there, we realized, no, it wasn't a life-changing trip. It was a life-affirming trip.
Oh.
It reaffirmed the things that are valuable to us, the things that are important to us, the travel, the adventure, and the way that we want to spend our leisure time outside of work and some of the things that we care about. Mm-hmm. That's what it was for us.
I love it. Well, you need to add Mountaineer to your LinkedIn profile, because I'm pretty sure that you get to claim that now, especially, and this was like the most, the merit badge that you would never want to have, as you were describing this to me, was when your guide was saying that it was the worst weather that he's seen on a summit day in his 13 years and hundreds of times doing it. Like, that to me is like, well, that's a fun merit badge for you guys to have. Not sure you necessarily want that, but if you're going to do it and you have to go through that crappy weather, at least it was the most intense weather, and not like, well, this was the 5th worst one. Like, nope, you guys get the worst weather. So
it's an interesting feather in the cap for sure.
Yeah.
We had the experience we had. I wouldn't go back to trade it for a different one, because it was the way that it unfolded for us, the things that went well, the things that didn't go according to plan or to go well, because there was a bit of both. But I think Kimberly, one of the owners of Creative Works, went with us on this trip, and I think there will be a future episode where we share lessons about life and business and mindset and a lot of those things from what we learned doing that summit.
I love it.
So stay tuned.
Yeah. Well, I'm super glad to have you back. I missed you while you were out. That was I realized how often you and I are just on side by side and hip to hip when we're doing things, and so that was a long 2 weeks for me. But I'm glad you're back and you guys did it safe. So, well, let's jump into today's topic. So, I put together a couple of things for us to chat on, but one thing, Mondo and I talked on a previous podcast of looking at vivid vision and some of these other things, and it made me want to do some additional deep dive content into change management. And the reason why is just, we talk a lot about different changes and all of this stuff, and we realize, like, change is really the only constant that we're going to have as business leaders, right? Like, there are always the curveballs. The inbox is never going to be at zero, all of that. It's a very true theme or thesis of our life here at Creative Works. And we also talk about, like, if you're not taking on new things, you're either growing or you're dying. And so if you're not facing these challenges, it means you're not doing anything new. And that should be a kind of a scary red flag for you, right? So having some of these things, dealing with change, dealing with the curveballs is good, as long as you're not dealing with the same problems over and over and over again, right? We want to graduate to new sets of problems that come with change, not necessarily dealing with the same problems. And so, we obviously know that the business changes that we deal with, this is whether it's new tech or new competitors or shift in laws and regulations that are happening or new economic forces that are in play or all of that stuff, that we deal with on a regular time. But it was interesting. I was, trying to make sure that I was well researched. And so I was looking through Harvard Business Review and some authors that we've listened to. And Harvard Business Review was talking about how like 50% of organizational changes are unsuccessful. And they really highlighted why knowing how to plan for and coordinate and carry out change is such a valuable skill for business managers and leaders both. And because with our podcast and folks that are listening to this, we have so many different folks, but having new people to your team, or just people that have been on your team for a while, but you haven't had to do a whole lot of change, or they just haven't had the opportunity to kind of be at the forefront of some of that change, was really something that I felt would be valuable for us to get into. And so our goal today is to highlight, hey, what are some of these different types of changes that you need to be aware of? But most importantly is what's that critical framework or formula that we can use repeatedly as we deal with a variety of different types of changes. So
when you shared that stat of 50% of organizational change, they fail, I think a lot of people felt that very deeply, because a lot of leaders have experienced that, or are currently experiencing a change they're trying to implement that is not going well.
Yeah.
And the reality of half failing is drastic, stark, but important to know.
Well, and the good news is that like knowing that that's a realistic piece, and what's just a better set of questions and framework that we can have to be above the 50% mark with that. Like, I look at it like the hitting average, right? If your batting average is 333, or I'm sure now that it's higher just because there are a bunch of studs and sports always get better. But if I can outperform what the industry averages are, and then also get my team a better position to have success with it, and we get better with change, like that's that compound effect that just starts rolling. So that's the goal of what I thought would be really impactful for us. But yeah, 50%. And it's because it lacks intentionality, it lacks accountability, those kinds of things. And so now it's like, let's understand what are some of the core different types of changes that we see, and what are the best ways to deal with it.
Sure. And so what I want to do first is kind of talk about the two different kinds of change, one being adaptive and one being transformational when it comes to a business or an organization. So adaptive changes, these are small, gradual, iterative changes over time that any kind of business is going to see. And so this could be evolutions to the products, or implementing new processes, or adjusting the workflows, or having new strategies. Some of the examples that they gave was, we were doing this research from Harvard Business Review and other places, are things like hiring a new team member to address an increased demand, or implementing a new work from home policy to attract more qualified job applicants. And then I wanted to take some examples of what does this look like in an FEC, a location-based entertainment environment. So this could be, maybe you've got a new software that you're adding into your overall software stack that doesn't have a giant ripple effect on the organization. Maybe this is the employee clock in, clock out software that you're going to be using, or maybe that you've made changes to your party packages, what's included in the costs to those. These are some of those iterative kind of adaptive changes that you would see over time. Now, one thing that I find interesting, because I've experienced this firsthand on both the implementation side as well as the receiving learning side of this, is let's say, for example, that you're going to be adding a new software to the stack in your family entertainment center, and you're the one doing the implementation. So you have done the research, you're doing all the setup of the software, you understand it more than anybody else at the organization because you spent more time with it. Then what happens is, when you go to show other people how it works, very often you know it really well. So you show it to them one time and you're like, great, they understand it, they know it, my job's done, move on. But that's not the way that it actually works. It takes many repetitions of using that software and understanding how it impacts the flow. And we're going to talk about some of the critical steps to make sure that any change that you implement sticks around for the long term and is successful. But this is just a little bit of a preview. Now, the other side of this is transformational change. These are much larger in scale and in scope, and these signify a dramatic departure from the current status quo, right? This is launching a new product or business division, deciding to expand internationally, things like that. But let's take this and zoom into what it looks like in an FEC environment. This could be, you're going to expand your facility, or maybe you're going to open a second location or an additional location. Or a great example of this is a traditional bowling center that's been around for a few decades. They renovate to then become a bowling entertainment venue that is not traditional anymore, and they add in 3 or 4 or 5 other attractions and rebrand. That's a part of this transformational change. Now, there's at Creative Works, we've experienced a lot of both adaptive and transformational change, especially if we just look at the last 2 or 3 years. Moving buildings to a new location was a transformational change for us. And one that we're in the tail end of implementation on is introducing this manufacturing software program that controls everything from the purchasing and every material that goes into every single prop that we build, and the order of operations and tracking the hours and all of the things that happen on the production floor from beginning to end. Now, one of the things I do want to point out is transformational change, regardless of how conservative you're being with that timing of, oh, this is going to take 6 months to implement. We understand the scope. We understand the workload. We have our milestones built out. Add at least 50% to that timeline and way more headache.
Yeah.
Because these kinds of changes require so much more than people generally think they will, and it takes a lot longer to fully implement. Our team has been working on this for a long time, and we're really starting to see the fruits of that labor, and it's amazing. But we thought we would be at this point a long time ago, and it just takes more time than anyone actually expects.
Well, and you know why I think that, you talk about add 50%, right? Like when you're building a house, it's like, oh, add 30% to your lead time on the construction and to your budget, right? Because there's just always unknowns. No matter how well researched we can be and bringing in experts, all of that stuff, there's just things outside of our control that will have its say in that. And one of the things that we'll talk about is like there's a difference between getting to that minimum viable, entry point, which is typically like an 80% completion mark, versus the full 100% in that sustainable part of the change, right? Like getting it past to where it launches and goes, that's not the end of the line, right? Like there's still a lot of work that has to be done. And that 20% can sometimes take as long as the first 80%, just because getting that buy-in that you're looking at and making sure that it's actually sticking and that there aren't things that need tweaked and adjusted from the results of the work that you're doing. And so that's where, in our heads, it's like, oh, well, it'll take this amount of time. Well, that's to where you're actually able to put it out into the wild. But then you still have to look at what's happening once it's out there and kind of running on its own, so to speak. And so we'll get into some of that. But one author that I really love, and she has a couple of books that are great. One is Life is Messy, Be Happy. Another is No Ego. It's Cy Wakeman. And one of the things that she talks about is that you are going to have a certain portion of your team, just because it's natural human behavior, that are highly resistant to change. And so you need to be very aware of what that's going to look like on your team, because a lot of times too, it's do we have the right buy-in? Are people being held accountable? All of that good stuff. But she really sets this stage of, if you're going through large change, and that's going to have a certain amount of folks that are going to be resistant to this, you need to be prepared in some situations to be ready to tell them, hey, you can either stay, enjoy, and work on this, or you can leave in peace. But what I don't want to have is have to be constantly working to get you back on board and rowing on the boat, because that's taking away from the critical work that we need to do to actually affect change, not get to the point of affecting change. And so one of the stats that she shared is your average manager is going to spend 80 hours extra a year on one person in resistance. So that's one person. It's 2 weeks or 1.5 weeks if you're a rock star pulling crazy hours, but per person that is not on board with this. And so she talks about also the odds of changing an individual's resistance are less than 3% and typically require a life-changing event for them to really get on board. So one of the things that we talk about constantly is knowing your team, knowing who are the best people to put in place for certain certain priorities or things that you're going to be putting into practice, because the biggest burden that you're going to have a lot of times is the call is coming from inside the house, so to speak, right? Like you're going to have people that you're just trying to get to row the boat in the same direction with the other team members that are going on there. And that's another one of those those factors that can lead to this 50% failure rate. So if we're not very candid and honest about what it's going to take to get this done and who we have on our team that's doing it, and whether giving them the option to be successful elsewhere, if this is critical enough to the future of the business, we really have to set the stage to them as far as that crafting the why, which is one of these 5 critical steps of change implementation. And Danny, I'm going to have you drop a little bit of knowledge on us as far as that goes.
It's interesting because we, for many different reasons, talk about why and starting with why. That's literally the name of Simon Sinek's first book of Start With Why.
Mm-hmm.
It's important for an individual to understand how it affects, one, the organization overall, why it's being implemented in the organization and what that outcome is, but also how it affects them individually. Mm-hmm. And being able to share the vision and share the why helps them wrap their heads around it, go, got it. Even if I don't fully understand every stage, even if I'm a little bit fearful, when they understand the why and believe in the why, it makes the how part a little bit easier for them to get through and sometimes endure, because change is not always easy. So
I just totally agree with you with that as well, because if they don't understand what the personal benefit to them of how this is going to make their day-to-day life better as well, that's that part of the 3%, right? Like ideally you're going to have people that are, on board and ready to go and they understand the team dynamic, but human beings still have a lot of ego that has to get put in check. And those first hurdles of the grind of change and going through that stuff, when you hit those bumps, if they don't have a personal why as to this is going to pave a path for me to grow within the organization, be able to make more money, be able to do whatever, like you do need to drill it down into that level. And so as you're working with your teams, it's not just the altruistic for the greater good piece. Like you need to understand how this connects and makes this better to that specific person in their time and their quality of life outside of the organization.
Mm-hmm. And the next part of that is it starts with the why, and then you go into the how. This is identifying what are the goals, the strategic goals. What are some of our key performance indicators that we're going to track over time? Creating some accountability and defining what is the minimal viability point for this change and for this project. And what I think happens a lot is that people skip the why, go directly to the how, which is still an important step. But without the why, no one cares, right? Without the why, they have no reason to implement any of these hows other than because I said so, which is not really a great way to inspire your team. And so the why and the how go hand in hand. And the last thing I'll mention before I throw back to you to talk about the next 3 stages of this is the fact that sharing the vision of the why one time is not enough. Right? The problem with communication is that we think it's happened. That's a quote that I don't even remember where that's from, but I love that quote. We need to be able to reiterate and share this vision multiple times in multiple formats, verbally, written, in video, in different ways, if it's going to be something large and transformational, because it takes that amount of time for someone to fully absorb, wrap their head around, and buy into that why. And so I wanted to make sure we share that as well. It's not just a one-time share, move on. It is crafting that why, not just at the beginning, but I think it's important to reiterate that at every single one of these stages and steps. So that's the why, and then the how. And Russ, I'm going to throw back to you to hit the other 3.
Yeah, over-communicating that change, right? Like you Ted Lasso fans that are out there, right? It's putting the believe sticker up there. It's living and breathing this through the everyday actions of what you're trying to do, right? Whether that's your culture and all of those kinds of things, or the specific task of the change at hand, it's got to be over communicated, right? And so it's also giving people that opportunity as you're implementing the changes and you're getting people into the actual work now that we've, hey, this is why we're doing it. This is how we're going to do it. We have a clear way of having these things that give us accountability and insights into how the change is actually going once we start doing it. This monitoring and accountability is the most critical piece, right? And we need to have real conversations with our team members of, hey, what's working for you as we're going through this? What's not working for you? Because we always know that there are those levels of unknown that are going to impact this. And so your job to work on the change as opposed to in the change, so that way you can make sure that that's all working smoothly. And if it's not, how are we removing those obstacles or making real-time adjustments to minimize the pain of those growth changes? And so this is all about identifying where the drama is and squashing that. And so if it's a personnel issue where you just have someone who says they're on board, but they're giving you a little bit of a yes man or yes woman response with it, but you're just not seeing the actual, higher level of engagement, that you sense that there's that 1 foot in, 1 foot out, it's taking some time with them. And this is part of that 80 hours a week working with a person, or 80 hours a year on one person who's resistant to change, is like, hey, this is really critical. Is there something that we haven't, expressed to you properly of why this is important, and do you not see the benefits of what this will have for you as an individual? Being able to squash some of that stuff, but keeping those things small while they're still small, or being able to move on from those quickly if it's someone that's not going to be best suited for that. So as you're actually implementing the change, it's consistently setting metrics for what we're going to do and how we're going to go about doing that, and defining those pieces, but then also being able to leave some wiggle room of, okay, well, hey, we've had to deal with this. Tim was going to be working on this project, and he was going to be the main stakeholder for it, but Tim has now left, and now we've got to readjust and pivot. It's why the whole team you can't have these things siloed as well. And so by identifying these drama pieces early, being very candid about why that's going to be acceptable or not acceptable through those things, and giving them the opportunity to be successful elsewhere if they're really going to be resistant to it. Because if the overall goal of this change is important and significant enough for the future of your team and your business and all of that to have the force for good that you want it to be, it can't come at the expense of somebody who's not going to be all in with it. And so this is that aspect of, are people putting in the requisite amount of work? Are they, just kind of going along for the ride? And you just need to be able to really make sure that those folks that aren't have an early exit from the process, so it doesn't hold up things unnecessarily. And so this is what gets us right of implementing those changes. That's what gets us to that 80% mark, or that minimum viable, viability point with something. And so once we actually implement the changes, now we get into that last 20% of the project, and that's the sustainability. So making sure that the team doesn't revert back to the old habits, go back to, forgetting some of the upsell scripts, aspects. Has it not been drilled in enough in the consistent reps that they need to override the muscle memory, and the synaptic pathways that they have channeled in from doing it the old way for years, or consistent, they've not known it any other way. That's hard, and people need a lot of repetition and exposure to do that. And so that's where the sustainability of this is really critical, because that's also where you can now fine tune, right? And one of the things that we talk about a lot inside CW is perfection is the enemy of execution, right? So we feel like we have to cross all the T's, dot all the I's, and have everything perfect before we actually get down to doing the work. And that is a great procrastination tool and keeping you from actually taking action. And so having this real-time piece of, okay, like we've launched it, we have this new thing, we're now targeting, we've made the changes in order for us to start targeting adults versus kids, and we want to be able to have more of this sophisticated look, but your team members need then that last 20% of sustainability to make sure that they're speaking the right language, providing the right white glove service to your guests that is resonating with that new audience that you're trying to target, or what have you. And so that is such a critical piece where, again, you may get it where it's checked off as successful, but in 2 or 3 months after that, you may have folks that are still going back to the old way and going, not holding the standard or holding the new standard to where it needs to be. And so then the last step that we talk about is just the review process, right? The postmortem. What has worked? What hasn't worked? Getting input from the team members of, hey, as we went through this process, and hopefully you have this in real time as you're going through the implementing changes and squashing drama of looking at this of, oh, shoot, okay, maybe we should have spent more time thinking about this. And you have some of those key changes that you want to do that are like, next time that we're doing some change, we need to be a little bit more cognizant of this, so that way we can better anticipate what that ripple effect is going to be. But having your teams buy in and input, so that way they feel heard and not dictated to, that's the next part. Because if you as we talked about at the beginning, change is a constant. And so we know that this is not the only change, right? This one point of emphasis, or this one thing that we've been focusing on and doing, it's not the only piece of change that we're going to have in. So as we continue to have to do more of this, how do we make sure that we're very tuned into what our team is going to need moving forward as we continue to implement new change over time? So with that, that's where we're going to be wrapping things up for you guys today. Again, as a recap, you've got those two different kinds of changes. You've got adaptive and you've got transformative. We need to understand kind of where the balance of those things go into, and then really those 5 critical steps of crafting the why, making sure that your team has the buy-in and truly understands the personal benefits to them as an individual, as well as the greater good for the organization, but really that personal piece that's going to have them go through the grind of the hardships of implementing it, really having those SMART goals, understanding the how are we going to hold people accountable, how are we going to measure this. Then you get into the sustainability. We got to make sure that after we get it past that minimum viable point, that we're actually getting in the new reps, so that way our muscle memory can be rewritten to make sure that this is going to last for the long term. And then finally, that review process, so that way the next time that we're doing change, we've got a great opportunity to be more successful every time with it, because we're paying attention and hearing what our team needs to implement these types of things. So with that, we've got continually more awesome content that's going to be coming your way through our weekly episodes. So be sure to come back again and hear more insights from us and our guests. And we will always be looking to, again, bring things that are going to serve you guys. So thank you for joining us today.
If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
As well as those 5 stars, please and thank you.
If you've got ideas for future episodes, guests, topics, follow us on social media, send us a DM.
And if you've got ideas for future content that you would love for us to be hitting up on, shoot us a message on our website or social media. And as always, big thank you to Mikey Mike on the 1s and 2s running the Ultranet, and we will catch you on the next episode. Did I repeat the same sentence that you did?
Yeah, you sure did.
Sake, man.
Cool.
Go Flight.
Go Flight. What is that from, by the way?
Hold on.
Sorry. I ruined it, Mike. I ruined it. We have to start over. My bad. Mike, I'm actually ready now, so
Okay.
well, let's do it.